All right. Well, I think we are going to go ahead and get started. My name is Julie Hill, and I am a volunteer with the conference today, and I am pleased to be our host for this presentation of Trauma, Its Impact, and Exploring Classroom Supports. So a couple of quick announcements before we get going. Do remember that closed captioning is available, so if that is something you need, you can go to the bottom of Zoom and turn on that transcript feature on your device. Also wanted to let you know that hopefully you have been finding the session evaluations. That's going to live at the bottom of the session description. So if you scroll toward the bottom there, you'll get that link to the evaluation. That gives us some great feedback on the session itself. And that is also what will trigger that PGP or CEU certificate for you. Lastly, hopefully we can put all of our comments and questions in through the Whova app. So we will be monitoring the Q&A and the chat feature there. So if you have questions and things come up during our presentation today, feel free to drop those in there, and we will ask our presenter to address those. So without further ado, wanted to quickly introduce our speaker, Jason Murrey. He is a husband to Amy and a father to 4. And Jason joined the Department of Education in 2019, bringing a decade of experience in prevention of suicide, substance misuse, and homelessness. Prior to his current role at the DOE, Jason was the first full-time suicide prevention coordinator for the state of Indiana. He creates and oversees training to support the field in bullying, vaping, suicide prevention, substance misuse, human trafficking, and dating violence. So he's obviously got a wealth of experience and expertise, and I'm very excited to hear from him. So with that, Jason, I will turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Julie, and thank you everybody for being here. I'm pretty stoked. I get excited when I get to present every morning when I wake up, because I think that especially when it comes to trauma, or what I just call life, it's super important that we address it and we acknowledge it, and we think of ways, how do we implement that to just, what connects us as being humans. That's going to be the theme, humanization, humanity, building those supports within our classrooms, within our school culture. Because I've always seen some good classrooms that do this really well, but overall in the school, potentially that culture doesn't exist outside of that classroom. So that can also create additional problems. So hopefully through this presentation, what we're going to do is we're going to just kind of go over those definitions very, very briefly in regards to trauma and adverse childhood experiences. ACEs, it's big studies coming out from 2003 all the way up to today. If you're ever applying for any state grants in regards to mental health dollars, or any federal grants from your schools or for your school district, usually when you include your ACE information, that helps out quite a bit. I'll give an example of the ACE questionnaire. There's a link to that within my links for this session. That will take you to the ACE questionnaire. If you've never seen it, it's a quick 10 questions. And then what we're going to talk about for the bulk of the time is resiliency. What does that look like? How can you identify it? What does it mean to be resilient? And how can we utilize resiliency to mitigate trauma within our classroom? So what is trauma? Right? It's an exposure to an event that threatens or harms the physical or emotional integrity of the individual or someone close to the individual. I want to make sure that the key underlined word here, exposure, is understood. It doesn't have to be something that physically first-person experience impact you. You could just be on the outside looking in and witness trauma occurring, or witnessing a violent act, or witnessing a non-appropriate act that may not be considered violent, but walking away and understanding that that somehow is going to impact you. If I have educators within this session, and if I have administrators, I want you to think about, your children that come in and out of your classroom. There's children that you make a connection with. There's children that you see within your classroom that are probably going through some pretty tough stuff at home. I always think about, the resiliency within our foster youth, occasionally having to change homes, having to change schools, and understanding that, there's a struggle, and you may build that connection, and chances are you just don't get to go home and stop thinking about that student. You probably think of those students before you go to bed, after you wake up, potentially when you leave the building. When you're lesson planning, you may look at, how do I incorporate this student within our lesson to ensure that they're getting everything that I want to provide to them. You are exposed to that secondary trauma. There's no ifs, ands, or buts about it. Being an educator day in and day out, you are exposed to secondary trauma. So as we go through this session, one of the things you'll notice is we'll be talking about, self-care. And I've given a lot of presentations. I've done a lot of QPR trainings with our school districts, and as well as first responders, police departments, as well as veteran organizations. And when I talk about self-care, it's always like, yada, 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 self-care. Yep, we hear self-care. How am I going to make that happen? And the most important part is that you give yourself time to have self-care, to do it, to work through some of that secondary trauma that you're experiencing, so that you can be able to put on your best next day. Because what ends up happening, right, when we hold in that trauma, is that when something bad happens to us, we don't just experience whatever that was at that moment. What we experience is everything we haven't really worked out up into that moment. And, as an adult, we're able to manage that fairly well. But as a youth, it can be very complicated. It can be very difficult. Trauma overwhelms a person's ability to respond in a healthy way, right? Physically, emotionally, or mentally. And it creates significant difficulties in functioning. So when we talk about our youth, there's a significant impact in regards to their social, emotional, and cognitive development, including their ability to self-regulate and learn. I'm not one of the advocates that's going to beat down social media. I think there's a great plus about social media. I know when I was deployed out in Iraq, social media allowed me to connect in real time with my family. But I also see, being a father of a 14-year-old and 11-year-old, that social media can have a very negative impact on one's life. There's a good explanation regarding the social media being called a sizzle reel. The best things in your life is what you throw up on social media, and individuals that look at this think, hey, that's the life that they're leading. Why I want that. Why can't I have that? When in reality, no, it's just a small glimpse. I always use an example. I had a good friend of mine took twins at the time, maybe 2 years old, made a long drive up to Mount Rushmore and in that area. And in his Facebook post, he talked about how wonderful everything was, and it was fantastic. And I mean, it just sounded like the greatest trip known to mankind. And I had been able to link up with him the following weekend, and I said, hey, when are you going to write your book? And he was kind of shocked. He's like, well, what do you mean? I was like, man, I've got kids. And if I was in the car for 6 hours, it'd be very difficult. It'd be a very difficult car ride, especially at 2 years old. I had to travel across the country with my 1-year-old. So, man, if you've got some secrets that you want to share, I think everybody in the world would be willing to pay about, how easy it is to travel with 2-year-olds for 12 hours in a car. And he starts laughing. He said, no, man, it was absolutely miserable. He says, I wrote that when my wife was very upset with me and hadn't talked to me in an hour. And so when I put it all together and wrote the post, I was able to kind of break the ice and be able to melt any of the icing, I guess, he had faced in the car. So, I always think about that when I see social media posts, and I always try to relay that to my 14-year-old and trying to explain to him that, it's be who you are, and be who you want to be. But be the best version of you. And I think it's also important, especially when we start talking about trauma and social media, and understanding that a post lasts forever. I think it's safe to say that, I don't know what my attendance is because I've turned all that down here on this session, or for those that are listening to this session after the fact. But as an adult, me and being 38 and having been in the Marine Corps, having adults' careers would be very difficult, I think, if we were all judged by what we did at 13 years old in the lens of a camera. And I think that, one, it's very important to kind of keep that frame in mind. especially when we're talking about our youth today and when it comes to discipline and what that may look like within our schools, but also when we're dealing with our youth and dealing with each other. You know, we're more alike than we are different. And so trying to create that connection, that bond that binds us, I think is super important. 3 types of trauma. Acute trauma, the response to a one-time event. This is just something that had just occurred. You know, I've had many experiences in regards to acute trauma. Chances are you have as well. And certainly many of your youth, many of your students, if you're an administrator, you can guarantee your staff has faced acute trauma before. When we start talking about complex and developmental trauma, this can usually be one or two different types of trauma occurring at the same time. Sometimes I know for me, horrific car accident late at night. I think for me, driving at night, it can be very tense. And sometimes I feel my body tensing up, holding on the steering wheel a little harder, especially if like my son and I, we just came back from Cincinnati and watched them spank the Phillies. But unfortunately, we were Philadelphia Philly fans. And so the drive back from Cincinnati, with all the cars flying by at 85, 90 miles an hour at the hours of 11:30 to 1 a.m. in the morning, you know, for me, that gets pretty intense. And so for me, that it triggers me, it goes back to me, and I always got to, you know, hey, work on that calming breathing. And then I kind of explain to my son what's going on in my body, what I'm feeling, and working through it. And that's super important, being able to talk about the trauma, how things are affecting you, anything in regards to PTSD or any of those emotions, being able to have the opportunity to speak about that and being able to work through it is absolutely critical to building resilience. Historical and generational trauma, a constellation of characteristics associated with mass cumulative group trauma across generations. I think that all comes to a head that we see today. You know, they always get in discussions when we talk about racism in America and what does that look like, you know, coming to the VA and being a veteran, you know, and getting the GI Bill. That was something that, you know, it's written down and it's afforded to all veterans, but our African-American veterans are having a hard time to utilize VA benefits and options, and other hardships that we're facing today and that we see today. So it's super important that gives us an opportunity to give individuals a platform to speak how they feel. What are the things that are bothering them, especially within our organizations, and we'll talk about a few exercises that we can implement within our building or within our classroom to make sure that everybody's included and that everybody has the same is on the level playing field in regards to, you know, how we're treated within the culture and the climate of our school. ACEs, adverse childhood experiences, potentially traumatic events that occur in childhood, 0 to 17. Some of these experiences are broken up into 3 categories, all right, through Dr. Nadine's study. You have abuse, neglect, and household dysfunction. You may not potentially identify with physical abuse or sexual abuse. You may not identify with emotional abuse, but sometimes, you know, you'll hear the criticism from parents. It could be emotional. Majority of the time when it comes to sexual abuse, it's somebody that's known. It's a family member that has done this. Again, I always talk about within the groups, you know, when it comes to holidays, you constantly, usually you'll see that same abuser on multiple occasions throughout the year that are usually supposed to be celebratory events. And for the victim, that's not the case. You can usually see these in your students right before the breaks, right before the holiday breaks, and potentially what that looks like in your classroom. When we talk about neglect, physical and emotional, this is usually some things that you would pick up on as an educator or just as an individual when you're building a relationship or that connection with an adult or with your student. To me, I felt like when I was working with youth, this was the one thing that I could pick up on in just regards to not necessarily physical or emotional neglect, but potentially here's a student that is wearing the same clothes 4 days in a row. And then trying to, hey, can I assist in a community clothing closet? What can we do to help the student? Walking out and thinking about, all right, what can I do for the student? Do they feel included, or they're not talking out? They're very shy. They don't come forward with any answers. Is that something that, if they did that at home, there could be repercussions or consequences? And just really trying to build that connection. But the neglect side of things, when I think of adverse childhood experiences, are the ones that necessarily stick with me, that I end up taking home with me, and I have to talk with my wife or journal and write about in order to work through all that. Household dysfunction, mental illness, incarcerated relatives, substance abuse, right? We talked about this opioid epidemic, right? It's still out there. I think, a lot of times we start talking about Noxalone and the ability and Narcan to have that on our school premises. What do we do if we find that a student has OD'd on opioids within our school? Do we have Narcan? Are we able to respond? Do we have an agreement within our hospitals? What does that look like for our students or for our staff that could potentially misuse opioids? Going through a divorce, right? I think what's the statistic? Half of marriages end up in the divorce. So chances are you probably have a staff member who's gone through a divorce, or you have a student who has seen their parents divorce or divorced multiple times, in the same way with their staff members. Again, we're more alike than we are different. You can imagine, hey, this could be a very traumatizing event. Have that conversation, discussion, being able to be open and working through that trauma. So, when it comes to those three categories, all those are highlighted on the ACEs questionnaire. You can pick up the questionnaire on the link that I've added into our summary. Some of the things of the questionnaire, depending on your score, what it means is higher the score, the higher the behavioral risk, the higher the risk to your physical and mental health. So some of those things that we see behavior-wise, with the higher score and higher score being 3 above, potential drug use, alcohol use, lack of physical activity, lack of any motivation. When it comes to mental health, also behavior, doing risky behaviors. When you have an ACE score of 4 or higher, right, we're seeing that there's actually a decrease of 15 years in your lifespan in regards to your ACEs or your adverse childhood experience, not necessarily correlated to your score, but just to those experiences. Higher risk of STDs, broken bones, again, thinking about risky behaviors for both of those, and then looking back at potential diseases. And here's just a couple of examples within the ACE questionnaire. I know just being here at the Department of Education and being with the social emotional wellness learning group, we're always trying to come out there and put behavioral wellness learning group. What we're always trying to put out the surveys and the conversations, just try to get a good climate of the state in regards to where we are with SEL. And one more survey or one more questionnaire, I know it's a lot to ask for our schools, but I like the ACEs questionnaire. It doesn't necessarily have to be something that is, hey, everybody takes it. I don't think it's a terrible idea. You just need to understand that those scores don't necessarily relate that 3 equals this individual is going to have cancer. That's not what this means at all. It's not a diagnostic tool. It's just a tool to kind of give you an idea of a potential environment that for me as an educator or as an administrator, I'd want to build around in regards to creating a climate of resiliency. So this was taken from the National Survey of Child's Health for the 2019 results. As you'll see, 14% of those from birth to 17 identified as having just 2 or more ACEs. Half of those that were surveyed identified having 0 ACEs. And so about half of everybody that was surveyed had at least 1 ACE. So looking at the Washington School Classroom and the Burke study, again, this was 2011, 13 of every 30 students in their classroom experienced toxic stress from 3 or more adverse childhood experiences. 51% of the children with 4 or more ACE scores had learning and behavioral problems in school, compared with only 3% of the children with no ACE score. ACEs are the best predictor of poor health and second best predictor of academic failure. And I want to key on the word predictor. All right. But when some folks think, oh, it's a projection or a prediction, that must be true. I'm here to tell you, do not take that as being the fact. What I would say is that it's just a strong warning. All right. If we have high ACEs, there's a good potential that the student, if not properly supported, may face academic failure. It doesn't mean because that they have 3 ACEs or 4 ACEs or they've experienced significant trauma that they're going to be an academic failure. All right, that is not what it means. So it's super important that we identify what the term predictor means in this slide and what that means for your student or for your staff. Just because they've gone through a lot of stuff, which I would call life, doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to have poor health or that they're going to whether or not be an academic failure, just be a not productive coworker, right? So I think it's super important to just know that those are predictors, and do understand that when our brains are stressed, they don't learn the same way. Sometimes the trauma may ensue our fight or flight. Sometimes the replay, whether it's a PTSD, may also occur within your building set, within your building climate, or within the classroom. Because these stressors either go unrecognized or there's a lack of knowledge about their effects or learning and behavior, students dealing with adversity and stress are often identified or mislabeled as having behavior, discipline, or learning issues in a school setting. The key word I'd like to identify on this slide is unrecognized. I know it's super difficult if I'm a high school teacher and I'm probably seeing 250 kids a day to be able to build a meaningful relationship with each 250. But I think it's super important to at least be able to acknowledge who that student is, or if I'm an administrator or just an adult, I think it's super important, like for my team, knowing who my team member is. I have a coworker that is our attendance officer, Lisa Truitt, but knowing her husband's name, understanding what her goals are within the department, and just getting the personal information so that she doesn't come in here, sit down at the desk and feel like, hey, she's just a cog on this SEVW machine, right? The last thing you want is your students to come in, sit down at the desk and just feel like they're there because they have to be there. And if they weren't there, no one would know they weren't there unless an attendance roll was taken. So being able to do your best to develop those type of relationships, and it's just a simple, quick hello, how are you doing? Making that door greeting, right? Letting them know that you feel their presence, you recognize their presence, you recognize them. And hopefully what we usually find, just those little things, you'll build some of those relationships, right, with a few of your students. And we'll talk about an exercise here in a few more slides to help out with that. But you'll be able to recognize when your student is under stress. You'll be able to recognize, and hopefully someone will be able to recognize when you are under stress, and be able to assist you in that situation. But sometimes, hey, stress is just part of life, right? So what do our ACEs scores look like? So I took a peek at our poll. I have the app pulled up here on my phone. Let me see here. What do we got? Polls. Session polls. All right. And so a vast majority, 14 of 20, have experienced 3 or more ACEs. And I know I'm asking this question not as a 0 to 17-year-old child, but as adults. And one of the things that I really want to point out, going back to those words that, hey, this is a predictor. This doesn't mean that because this child has 3 ACEs, they're going to fail. Right, is showing that look at where we're at today, with the vast majority of us having more than 3 ACEs or adverse childhood experiences, vast majority of us probably having some pretty serious trauma. But we're here today, putting on our best selves, assisting and enriching the lives of youth who will be choosing what potentially life looks like for us tomorrow, as we get older, but also carrying and assisting our fellow coworkers. Looking at my question, another poll question I had was, how do you feel? How do you feel right now within your environment? Are you respected? Are you, and not in the sense of just respect, are you respected as a human? Do you feel like you have support from top down? Do you feel like if you had any issues, you would be able to ask for help and get it? Do you feel like that when your students come into that climate, that they feel like they're getting the best opportunity for their education and it's being provided by the staff, by the school? And I called that was humanization, right? When we start understanding we're more alike than we are different. And then another question was, do you feel as if you are just a cog in a machine, that you are just filling the seat, that you're constantly reminded that, you know, any day tomorrow you could be replaced? And in that aspect, the majority of our attendees feel like a number one. They feel like, hey, our school, our building are using a lot of good humanization practices. I feel valued. I feel like I'm given opportunity to grow. And we do have a small percentage that feels potentially, you know, that I don't, and it's stressful and it's pretty difficult. And I can imagine that that's pretty difficult to be able to perform, you know, in that type of environment. So what are some of the things that we can do within our system to ensure that we all have the opportunity to grow? So looking at that is building upon some of those traumas we've experienced. What happens when you're consistently in the face of trauma? I go back to calling this your normal versus my normal. It's super important to understand that your normal is not exactly the same normal as everyone else. In fact, it's probably very far and different. Taking a child that has absolute chaos and falls asleep to chaos, and then going into a classroom that's absolutely quiet and no one's allowed to speak, that could be pretty chaotic to them. To where potentially for me, going into an environment where there's not a whole lot of noise, I'm good, I'm ready to go. But I also don't live in an environment where that silence is unsettling because something's getting ready to happen. So it's super important to understand that your normal is not everybody else's normal. So when going into resiliency, it's the capacity to recover quickly from difficulties. I don't like the word toughness, right? Coming from a veteran standpoint, being a veteran myself, you always hear, you know, going through, you're not tough. Taking the idea that, you know, just your bachelor's level education or your master's level education in the field of education, being a teacher or an administrator, you went through some weeks, you went through some hours of being in the classroom, watching it happen, putting your toes in the water, experiencing classroom environment, and then next thing you know, you're hired, you're in it. I call that there's some training involved there to get you into that profession, to get you comfortable in doing what you're doing. In that veteran community, myself being a Marine, it was 13 weeks of absolutely removing Jason Murrey, the person, and making it Jason Murrey, the Marine. And getting out of the Marine Corps, it was just 2 days of, hey, here's how you write your resume. You know, good luck, have a good day. And so, you know, it's very common to see veterans struggle out here in, you know, what we call a civilian world. But it's also very common to see our educators, our administrators, just humans in general struggle when we get out of the systems of which we've got to take away who we are and conform into this, into whatever you want to call it, small society, whether it's in the military, whether it's the school culture, when you don't have a part of defining what that is. And those parts that help you define what that is and become a part of that, I recognize as protective factors. So what are some of those things that we can build up to build our resiliencies and build those resiliencies for our students and for our staff that are impacted by trauma? One, creating those relationships, having those positive relationships. Being a DOE, you know, I get to see the great and I get to see the absolute terrible in regards to how this can go great and how this goes wrong. Again, I always put that caution with social media as well. But it's super important to be able to build those positive relationships and that you have somebody that you can talk to and somebody can potentially talk with you. I know that for our educators, for a lot of you, you know, you might be that person for a lot of these students. These students may not have a home life that allows them to talk about potentially their mental health. I mean, let's face it, we don't talk about mental health at all. Come 2020, it was a buzzword. There's a lot of rage. a lot of conversation. I was happy to see those federal funding dollars go into mental health supports during 2020, but now here at 2021, coming almost up on July, those conversations have almost stopped completely. And so I think it's super important to just understand that our mental health has an impact, as you also saw in those ACE illustrations, on our physical health. Another protective factor, creating opportunities or just growth. Growth for the student, growth for the professional, growth just for the adult. Inclusion, and what I mean by inclusion, I mean belonging, having a sense of belonging, creating that for others, but also being valued, right? We need to be able to be valued where we're at. I know, we talk about workforce capacity here at DOE, and we talked about leadership development. And for me, one of the most important workforce capacity components you can have is retention. It's nothing, there's nothing worse than having a great leadership build, but you can't maintain those leaders within your culture, right? It's be able to have that retention and be able to hold on to that mind trust, because it's super expensive to constantly have to rotate out who your teaching staff's going to be, who the administration staff's going to be, who our employees are going to be, who does our parents contact? Because a lot of times, when we have a constant turnover within our school districts, those contact points change. And it goes back to creating that inconsistency. And one of those things that it's super important when we're building out resiliency is consistency. Sometimes the school day is the only consistent thing in a child's life. And so for me, I think it's super important that we protect that. Clarity is another great protective factor. What do I mean by that? Being able to set goals and expectations. I was just at a training at Lakeview Schools. I provided suicide prevention training up in Gary just a few weeks ago. And one of the teachers, I always ask the educators before I start suicide prevention is one, I've never been in a classroom as an educator myself. But I can imagine that somebody in a teacher's life impacted them in the sense that they would want to teach. And normally what ends up happening is that impact has nothing to do with the class. I had a gentleman, he taught history, and his impactful teacher was math. And it wasn't math that made him excited. It was the way that the teacher taught the math, but also connected with the students, and then followed up and maybe asked, hey, how was your weekend? How are things going on? Or you got this test, what are your plans to study? And he talked about how this teacher had some pretty high expectations, where in the rest of the schools, his 60 through 100 was the grade scale. But hey, in this classroom, a 65 was failing, right? It'd be like, well, why is this teacher got to be so hard? But always having a high bar that he had to constantly climb and strive and try to reach. And as he would say, he didn't hit it all the time, and he probably fell short more than he actually made it. But wherever he landed, he always felt like he was a little further than where he had originally thought he was going to end up. And so he utilizes that in his classroom today. And I tell him, here we are, 2021. What would happen if you had a different grading scale in your class and the rest of your teachers? And I think we all understand what would happen. You guys would have a lot of parent conferences going on at that moment. But being able to set expectations and clear direction and maintaining the goals, I think it's super important, and especially what that looks like in the classroom. But it's also good for you professionally, right? I think the worst thing we can possibly do as humans is stay stagnant. That we're humans. That's not what we're built for. We're not built to stay stagnant. We always need to be moving forward. How do we make tomorrow better than it was today? I always have a motto when I look in the mirror in the morning. I want to see a different person when I look in the mirror at night. Hopefully I've improved some way, somehow. And sometimes it's not always the case, and that's all right. I'm human. I'm not perfect. And I can accept that. But usually when that does occur, it's because I didn't have a good goal mapped out, or a good plan on how I was going to go, improve myself that day. And then the next piece is self-esteem, all right? Developing that, not just for yourself, not within yourself, but also within others. That helps build up the fortitude, just stepping up, doing the right thing, being able to have courage in the face of a lot of adversity. I think today, we have some challenging times today. And so it's super important to understand who you are and what you stand for, and having the courage to voice that. Because sometimes, what I find is it's super important to be able to have that conversation, and building my resiliency, because I might have a view or a belief that isn't true, and it could be founded on not facts. But being able to have a conversation with others who think differently from me, I think it's important that we can learn from one another, because again, we are all more alike than we are different. And I feel like today, anything you put on, we're split apart. No one says, hey, we're all humans. And if history's ever told us anything, it's certainly taught us that before there's this total destruction, there's this dehumanization process that always occurs. And I always feel like it's, whether it's political beliefs, whether it's on lines of race, no one ever has that conversation that, hey, we're human. This is where we all can connect. It's always division, division, division. So being able to have the fortitude to stand up, have your own beliefs, be able to share those and build those connections where other forces may be trying to divide us, I think is super important, more so today than it ever has been. All right, so how are we mitigating the effects of ACEs in our classroom? 3 key points I think are super important. Being a mentor to your students, being a mentor to your coworkers, having opportunities to bring mentors in. Sometimes, hey, I know from an educator standpoint, some folks will argue, well, they're only in schools from the fall to the spring. Well, I don't know an educator that stops working in the summer, right? There's always a planning cycle. Looking at my craft, how do I improve that? Looking at new lesson plans, potentially there's never a break. So potentially having that time to mentor with students, being able to run a group after school may not be in the cards, but how do we have opportunities to bring others from outside of our school to be mentors for our youth? Modeling the behavior within the classroom, talking about, sometimes when we slip and fall flat on our face. I'm pretty sure everybody here on this, within this session, or if you're listening to this session after the fact, it's been recorded. And even for myself, you might have had goals that you have not hit, or that you tried to pursue, and maybe you didn't pursue them as hard as you may have started pursuing them, right? And you hadn't got there. It's okay to be upfront and talk to, and discuss that with your students, being able to create those realistic goals and developing pathways to achieve those goals. But most importantly, I think, is support. We have to be in an environment where we can support one another, where our students are able to support one another. And we also have to give time to allow that support to happen. I love this picture on the top right on my screen. I believe it's probably the same direction on yours, with all these educators brought together. If you Google images for educator support, this is going to be the first one that pops up. It has a great link to their school and to their programming and just how they support one another. So you get an opportunity to check that out, and just, and it's also good to just kind of talk about within counselor talk with your school counselor. Chances are they're subscribed to a counselor talk listserv, throwing out questions of, what are you all doing within your school district to build connections with each other? It's a good way to get feedback out from the field to just various ideas and various programs put together that can be duplicated at your school district. Professional activity to build resilience. I think this is the most important one. This is the same one that I discussed with first responder communities, whether I'm at a sheriff's department, whether I'm within a school or school leadership. Leadership leads the way. You have to set the example. My second bullet point over here under why is it normalizes this behavior. First and foremost, I go back to that word toughness I told you I didn't like. Imagine you're sitting in their staff meeting, whether you're a team lead, whether you're an administrator, whether you're the principal, or whether you're the superintendent, being able to go in. My example is that leadership walks through the steps of utilizing your employee assistance program. Chances are within your health plan, you have an EAP, or you have another wellness program. What does this look like? Leadership picks up the phone, utilizes the EAP, and sets their appointment in front of the staff. They don't have to talk about what's going on in the appointment. They just set it. All right. And then they encourage staff to do the same thing within the next 2 weeks. I always like to throw a timeline. We're usually between 2 to 4 weeks for everybody else to set this up. Now, they don't have to go to this appointment. You just want to show them that they can, that you said it and that you're supporting it. There's a lot of wellness programs out there. There's a lot of EAP programs. And sometimes it's there, it's given to us, but we feel like if we use it, we're ostracized within the organization. So it's super important going back to normalize it, because I've given you quite a few examples of just how secondary trauma impacts us as educators, as administrators, and just as adults. And, you know, if we don't work that out, if we don't deal with that, it's just gonna build up. There's no such thing as a piece of your brain where you can compartmentalize and just hide your trauma or terrible thoughts. Right? There's no little bucket you can just start pushing things in and it just goes away. What ends up happening on your worst day again is you just don't deal with whatever that event was, but you deal with all those events that you thought you stored away and didn't process all at the same time. And that can be overwhelming for sure. This builds team and the family culture. You're immediately showing to your staff that you care right off the bat. I care about you. This is the most important thing. I need you here every single day of your contract. Your kids need you here. I want to make sure that you're well. It also reinforces that you're not alone. All right. Not immediately. If a superintendent wants to know how is it that I can connect with my educators, maybe I may have potentially been computer science, went through the route through administration, and hey, here I am as a superintendent. How can I connect? This is one of those ways you can connect. I'm setting this up. I need this. If you need this, guess what? Hey, that we're more alike than we are different. And again, it encourages self-care. I've heard from administrators, they hate the word self-care, but I'm telling you, I don't know any other way to define it, because it's the one thing that we don't do enough of. And if it didn't work, then I'd shut up and not talk about it. But I promise you, taking care of yourself first and foremost. There's a reason when you get on an airplane, right, and they talk about the oxygen mask, they tell you to put your oxygen on first before you help another. Chances are, if you're helping someone else and you're not taking care of yourself, you're going to pass out and then potentially aren't able to help that person that may be in need, right? So you have to take care of yourself if you're expecting to take care of others. And going back here to this quote, just knowing that, you know, success, no one ever does anything alone. There's somebody always in the background that's pushing, cheering, provided that support. They could potentially be alive today. They may not be alive today, but there's always somebody or someone that has always assisted to help you get to where you're going. And sometimes it's also helpful to reflect on that. Reflect who helped you get to where you're at today, and maybe write that thank you letter out and send that in the mail. That's something I think we get away from too much as a society today. We can easily send emails, but a handwritten letter, I think, is the most powerful tool you can utilize today, especially showing gratitude and appreciation for those who have impacted you in your life. So first activity, leading the way, utilizing your EAP, and informing your staff that it's okay to utilize any sort of wellness program that you have within your building. Sometimes it's even great to set up groups. And as a superintendent or a team lead, you're part of it. You're there. And next activity, journal exercising. So this is something that as an educator, you could also do. Or this is something that you can do as an icebreaker within your meetings in a professional setting. But asking your students, you know, how is it that they can acknowledge 3 things that they're grateful for or appreciate, you know, what would that be? Putting that down in the journal. And then midweek, hey, reflecting, and usually we have homerooms within middle school and high school that this would be a great exercise for. Reflecting on your week at this point, have you gained a new appreciation that you could add to your list? How has your list assisted you in dealing with difficulties you have encountered? This helps me from the suicide prevention standpoint of understanding, okay, what is it that you have to live for? And that may sound like a funny question, but for me, it is the most important question. What are the things you appreciate in life? because those are the things that are going to keep you going. And then there towards the end of your week, share how acknowledging gratitude has helped you with a friend or with another classmate. Usually this could be, a sharing from a teacher to the class, and then just encouraging the students to have an opportunity to talk about it amongst one another, or potentially fielding questions, from class and allowing them to speak it to the whole class instead of just one person to the left or to the right. But this helps build resilience by acknowledging what you appreciate, things that can be appreciated or what you're grateful for. Going back here to this quote, finding gratitude and appreciation is a key to resilience. People who take the time to list things they are grateful for are happier and healthier. Classroom activity and to build resilience. This is the big one we talk about, especially when we discuss trauma-informed practices. I call it the for us, by us, and rule development. Compliance improves when everyone is a part of the creation process. I understand that, doesn't matter wherever I've gone, whatever the first day was, there was always a set of rules that was already created that I'm expected to uphold. But what if we could take a look at those rules and say, how does this apply to us? Does this make sense? What would you like to change and why? Or I like the question asking my students, if you were in charge, what would be some of the things that you would want as a rule? As fielding many or leading many counseling sessions in regards to the addictions field, this was one of the things that we started in every session. What were the rules of the group? I didn't have any rules other than everybody had to respect one another. Outside of that, they could create their own rules. So some rules would be, you may say that would be respecting others, but not to talk until someone else is finished. Or some folks still like to raise a hand and to be able to discuss. Being allowed to debrief their thoughts or feelings was something that would sometimes be a rule that would be added. But it's super interesting. I also think that process is a good way to also get to know your students a little bit better as well. Kind of hearing their thoughts and some of their concerns and what they like. Maybe a classroom rule is, hey, Fridays we all can wear blue. We're the blue team or whatever the case may be. There may be just rules that are specific to your class that don't have anything to do with regulation or discipline. It could have something that helps create that culture of the classroom or within the school itself. And then looking at your mid-year, end of year, evaluate those rules. Bring students back together. If it's in your home classroom, how these rules work. Are they working? Do we need to change them? Are we getting the benefits that we expected when we created these rules? What does that look like? So evaluation is super important. It always goes back to if you're doing something just for the sake of doing it, stop it. Have a purpose behind your action. And this activity here helps you drive and utilize, all right, what's our purpose and what's the action we're doing to drive that purpose. School year preparation activity. I'm pretty sure I picked this up from the School Safety Academy. I thought it was absolutely fabulous when it was discussed. All right, so I'm going to walk you through the scenario prior to the start of the school year or returning from a break. I know, when we have those 2-week fall breaks or winter breaks, sometimes we have that professional development time built in that first week. Place each student's name on an index card. I know for some of our schools that can be very difficult. We have thousands of students. But maybe for our smaller school districts, we just got a few hundred. It's important though that to get every student's name on an index card or on a rock or on something that can be selected by staff. And what you're going to do is you're going to put all the kids' names on the index card, put them on a table or put them on a billboard or set them up, whether or not it's on the bookcase, doesn't matter. I would recommend ABC order because as a teacher going up, I know some students' names and I can just easily grab their cards if they're in alphabetical order instead of scattered among 400 or 500 other students. But one by one, what you're going to do is you're going to pull students from the pile that you know or you have a connection with. At the end of the exercise, there will typically be a pile of cards of students that no one has a connection with or knows. And that's a scary spot, but that's an absolute reality. And so it's certainly important that we identify members of our staff who can take it upon themselves to pick up that card of a student that no one knows or has been identified yet, and reach out and try to make a connection with that student throughout their, whether, that school year, whether it's in the hallway, just saying hello, whether it's during their lunch period, whether it's during your prep time, or whatever the case may be, being able to make that connection. If you go back and we talk about school violence, whenever there's unfortunately at school shooting, that's all the rage. That's what's always talked about constantly, but that is the least likely school violent event to occur within your school district. But when you go back to the Secret Service report in regards to school shooters or school violence, you'll find the one thing that every single one of them had in common is they felt like they had zero connections within that school. And so I think it's super important that we build the connections. One, that no one walks through the halls feeling like they're just a cog, that they have nothing to live for, that they're not appreciated. And so this, to me, is probably one of the most important exercises right outside of having a superintendent stand up and say, hey, I'm going to make this call to my employment assistance EAP program. I hope you all do the same in the next 4 weeks. And being the example that at the end of the day, hopefully by the end of the school year, every student feels a connection with somebody within your building. All right, so at this time, if there's any questions or additional thoughts, it looks like I have about 8 minutes left. And I will look at the Q&A in the Whova app. All right, I just had one question. Very opinions about giving ACE tests to all students. What are your thoughts? If I can caution that it's just a predictor, those scores don't necessarily mean anything, then I would say let's go ahead. It helps you out as an educator to kind of see where your student's at, or the administrator in developing what that climate of your school is going to look like, or for your team. For me personally, I encourage that. I'd want to utilize that if I was in charge. Now, you might have parents may not feel good about that, but I also think if you're going to utilize a school-wide ACE questionnaire, then you should probably have your ACE questionnaire posted on your site, so that parents and anybody who would want to opt their child out, they could. But I've also certainly found that when we do those type of things, it's not necessarily looked at all the time. So I'd rather be safe than sorry, but more information is better than no information. So I'd highly encourage it.
Okay, yeah, I'm not seeing any other questions. So with that, I just want to thank Jason for his insights and his presentation today. I know he had his email address was on that very first slide. So if you do have other questions after the fact, I'm sure he would be happy to point you in the right direction and share his wisdom that way as well.
Yeah, and because we're being recorded, again, my email is jmurray1@doe.in.gov, or you can reach me at 317-966-5408. And right now I'm looking for schools to go out and provide suicide prevention training for. So if you're interested, please reach out and let me know.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Jason. And thank you all for being here. Just a reminder to fill out that session feedback form. And I hope you all have a wonderful rest of the conference.
Thank you, Julie. Y'all take care and have a wonderful day.